Today on this podcast we have Stan Efferding, we have Simon Chang, Ian Daniel, Alex Usler,
Hello.
Hayden Bow, and myself. Hope you guys enjoy.
All right. How'd you get the Rhino nickname? We have two rhinos.
We're rolling right into this thing,
Right
huh?
into the most important question of the day.
This is the most important thing because this guy, I'm pretty sure you get it all the time. Who's the one true
Who's
rhino?
the real rhino?
Oh, man.
Hold on. What
December.
year was your rhino established?
It was 2008. Flex Wheeler was training me, and he called me the White Rhino. I think that was because he couldn't remember my name.
You're the real fucking rhino. That's it. It's decided.
Here's my thing. I think the Rhino title is like an accolade, and you can't call yourself it, right? I think it has to be bestowed upon you by someone of greater power.
I see. And yours was Rich Froning?
Yes.
I mean, those are Flex Wheeler and Rich Froning.
Those are high up there.
Who's the higher up though? Between them two.
Flex
I don't know
Wheeler.
who values
Yeah.
CrossFit more, who values bodybuilding more.
I think bodybuilding's more popular overall.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm trying to get away from it. Nobody takes a guy seriously that calls himself a Rhino.
Really? I think it's the opposite.
Don't even include it in the social media handle.
Right.
Don't.
Right. I'm just dad these days.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what you've got going on, because I know you do a ton of different things. You have the Cooler, you're the creator of the Cooler, founder of the Vertical Diet. These are two of our nutrition coaches, so we brought them on to, talk a little bit of shop with you.
We've been really busy with the Vertical Diet. Obviously, it went viral worldwide now. We probably have over 100,000 unique visitors to the site. That's not just everywhere I go, I hear people are using it. The fact that I put a name on it kind of irks some people. The named diets, tend to draw some concern about fads and what have you. But I've worked hard. It's something that I've used probably for well over 10 years with my clients. And then when I did that seminar in Iceland with Hafthor, it became so popular. I think we've got over 4 million views now. I just had people reaching out to me from all over the world, and so we wanted to put a product out that people could actually have all the information in one place. And what I've been doing, ever since I started training, was just accumulating information that I thought was beneficial for me and then eventually for my clients, because I studied exercise science in college, and I trained, I was a high school soccer coach, and I trained football players for many years, and I've been training athletes all my life. And I want each athlete to have access to all of the information rather than, starting out with a blank script every time. Obviously, they're all unique in their own way. But, what I found, just like when you're running a business, which I've had many businesses over the years that I've run, I always have an operations manual. And so every new employee that comes in, that goes through training, they get the operations manual. And then we build on that over time as processes improve. And I kind of did the same thing with the nutrition program that I've been using with my clients for many years. Is I made sure they had everything they needed, or I thought they needed, to be successful. And it wasn't just the diet. It was the sleep, it was the hydration, it was the recovery, and obviously the nutrition is a key component to that, along with whatever training mechanism they're using, whether it's hypertrophy or strength training or cardiovascular work. And I wanted them to know what my philosophies were, things that I felt worked best for me and for the clients that I trained. And so I put it all together, and I put a name on it, and I set it out there for people to have access to, so that they could see, what have I learned, both academically and practically from my experience, and with feedback from my clients, because I think that you always learn something from your clients. It's always a kind of a collaboration. And so every time somebody asked me a question, if I didn't have an answer, I would try and make sure I put that into my operations manual, my Vertical Diet and Peak Performance ebook. And so that's really what it is. It has really afforded me an opportunity to give about 99% of everything I've learned over the years to someone in a real quick, easy to digest, kind of a program they can implement, so they don't have to ask me 1,000 questions right off the bat. They can just get going. And that's kind of what's been my big project. And now we've rolled that out into, in addition to the ebook, we're doing seminars, obviously, and we're certifying coaches, because I think one of the big shortcomings right now is bridging the gap between people who have academically learned so much and practically learned so much. And the vast majority of clients out there don't really have the time or maybe even the interest in learning all the things we've learned. And now we have access to so many great resources, like Steffi and like, Greg Knuckles' group out there, and Brad Schoenfeld and Brett Contreras and Alan Oregon. And the list goes on of the academics that are also lifting, the Lane Nortons of the world, people who are academically so smart, but also lift. And these are things that we didn't have when we were starting out. 30 some years ago, the internet didn't even exist. And now you've got 18-year-old kids who have accumulated in just a couple of years' time as much knowledge as it took us decades to accumulate. And they're applying it, and they're so much more successful at such an earlier age. I always said if I knew then what I know now, I would have been much more successful much earlier in my career and probably suffered many fewer setbacks along the way. So that's kind of what I'm doing most, is I'm just trying to get the information out there. My goal is to educate coaches so they can implement better programs with their clients. Because I think that's the gap that needs bridged now is between all the information that we're aware of and getting it to people who don't have the kind of opportunity we have to invest our entire life into accumulating this knowledge and applying it.
That's such an important point. We just spoke to the DPT class at Ohio State yesterday.
Yeah.
And one of the things you said was, I love it because they're all such like research paper nerds, and you're like, nobody cares about your research paper. Like, whatever you do, like, you're just doing it for other nerds. If you nerd out on it totally. So it's the bridging the gap part that's super important. You need to be able to take this information that's complex, that's taken you your whole life to accumulate, and put it into something that people can actually use.
They can actually apply it and get results.
Simplify it and make it a step-by-step, something that people can just understand what the progression is and the necessary steps to reach their goals, essentially.
Yeah.
What's the premise behind the vertical diet?
A lot of things. What I've seen in the industry, what I saw even 30 years ago, that people, women, I've been training women and men for competition since the late 80s. And I saw the same thing. I saw the over-restricted dieting, people suffering from a host of different deficiencies such as anemia, amenorrhea, the female triad. I saw men losing extraordinary amount of muscle tissue and strength in these over-restrictive dieting. So on that end of the spectrum, in the professional dieting industry, bodybuilding, figure, physique, and bikini, I saw that people weren't fueling themselves appropriately, and they would end up, I think, losing too much muscle, and then rebounding from that with a lot of edema, fat gain, and all of the depression and that goes along with that, particularly for women. And unfortunately, over the last 7 or 8 years since this industry's exploded, I've seen the same problems. I've seen these guru diets with egg whites, white fish, and broccoli, and 2 hours of cardio a day, and the damage that it's doing to women in particular. Guys eat more food, tend not to have as many of these deficiencies. They have problems on the other end, which I'll talk about next. But that's always been a concern to me. I see them suffering through, unnecessarily so, these pre-contest diets, over-restriction. We see it in athletes now, too. We just saw the report in Oregon, the distance runner that had starved herself down and ended up with osteoporosis and had shin splints and a host of other, obviously anemia and amenorrhea and the rest. We see them suffering unnecessarily from over-restricted diets because they exclude things from the diet that I think are really important. They exclude red meat. There's your iron and B12. And then they end up in the doctor's office getting a shot for iron and B12. It just boggles my mind. They exclude the egg yolk. There's your biotin and choline. Now they start losing their hair, and without the choline, now you've got issues with liver, fatty liver disease, etc. So I see these things happening, and I thought that with all the great information we have now, the great nutritionists that are out there, that things would improve, but they've gotten worse. And I see more and more of these young women in particular suffering from hair loss and anemia and amenorrhea and the host, and having these horrible rebounds. You watch them go through these cycles of dieting down. And if that were isolated to the bodybuilding community, then you might not think it's such a big deal because it's such a small percentage of the people. Unfortunately, what's happened is that the general population sees these women get on stage in a bikini in the best shape of their life, and I'm using air quotes now to say that, because it's outside physically, but physiologically inside, they're a mess. And then these diets have started to permeate the mainstream. And now you've got people shunning red meat, dairy, fruit, salt, all the things that help them to be vibrant and give them energy and help retain lean muscle tissue and provide them the micronutrients that they need to be healthy. And so now you've got this yo-yo dieting going on in a much greater percentage of the population. What they're not aware of is the dirty underside of this whole thing, which of course I'm familiar with, being a pro bodybuilder and powerlifter all these years, is that the women that are dieting in the bodybuilding, figure, physique, bikini industry, to compensate for these deficiencies in order to not lose as much muscle, etc., or not have their, or to still be able to lose weight, will use performance-enhancing drugs. They'll use Anavar. Well, the general population isn't doing that, so they're losing an enormous amount of muscle. And we know from research that when you rebound, the more muscle you lose when you diet, the more likely it is you'll gain more fat when you stop, and your metabolism will be less than what it was before and may not recover for many months, if not years. They'll use thyroid medication, these professional dieters in bikini and figure physique industry. And that might not be the case in the general population. So now their metabolism is
staying elevated when it should be tanking.
Yeah, and they'll end up, with their hair falling out, and they'll end up obviously on these over-restricted diets that they can't lose weight anymore because their metabolism slowed. So those kinds of things concern me more, that the competitive industry is getting away with using these over-restrictive diets for a short period of time. We don't see the rebound. We only see them on stage.
Sure.
I'd like to show them a week or two after, so the general population could see, okay, this is what happens when you do that.
I'm sure anyone of us who's been in the gym long enough, you see those guys or girls that finish the shows, look phenomenal on stage, and like 2 weeks later, you're like, that's a different person.
It's tragic.
Yeah.
It's really tragic. So I don't mean to be too long-winded about it, but it's personal to me because I've lived it, myself and with my athletes and friends and clients all these years. That it's really important that we step back and we make sure that we aren't so restrictive with these people and that we understand what it's doing to them, to their body. So basically what I'm saying is that with the vertical diet, I just wanted to make sure and keep important micronutrient dense foods in the diet, such as red meat, such as dairy, which I think is really important, not just for calcium, but for obviously for bone mineral density, but also for muscle contraction and nerves signaling. So all those things are important. Fruit, I think it's hugely important for the diet. So it's pretty diverse in that regard. And that's helped my athletes. I've worked with a lot of athletes up to the Olympia level in women's competition. And there's a young lady downstairs who we just prepped for the Arnold this weekend. And some of the things that my athletes say consistently is, I was so much stronger, I had so much more energy, they retained more muscle tissue. And that's the way it should be. You shouldn't be exhausted and depleted. And I know people think that you should. But the fact of the matter is that if you do it right and you're feeding yourself well, you should maintain a significant amount of strength. Because if you're losing strength, you're losing muscle, and that's not the goal here.
I feel like that restrictive approach is so glorified in bodybuilding. It's like people just almost want to be able to say they're suffering for end result, and for some reason that makes it like
we wear it as a badge of honor.
Yeah.
That we suffered the most, and then we think that translates into improved performance, and that's simply not the case. So I look at these people as athletes, not dieters. I want them to be able to perform well in the gym and to hold on to muscle tissue. And we can get them lean, like with Nadia Wyatt in the Olympia. We just took her from a New York steak to a top sirloin steak down to a top round or a sirloin tip. In doing so, we eliminated some fat and some calories along the way, but we maintained all of the iron and B12 and selenium, and we kept whole eggs in the diet, so she never had a problem with the hair loss or things like that. Her skin stayed
It's such
nice.
You bring up such an interesting perspective to dieting, because you're obviously not neglecting the importance of calorie exclusion, but you're emphasizing the inclusion of nutrient dense foods, which is something that is so heavily neglected in today's dieting principles by society. Because, and especially with as well the explosion of IFYM, flexible dieting, it became about restricting your calories while eating what you want, to the point where people are severely neglecting eating nutrient-dense foods.
Yeah, and my concern with that is, and I'm not here to crap on anybody's diet. That's not my goal. My concern is there's some priorities that should, there's some considerations that need to be had. And when you, if you're going to do IIFYM and you're on a relatively restricted diet, 1,600, 1,500, 1,400 calories, doesn't leave a lot of room for you not to be choosing nutrient-dense foods. And the more calories that you just eat kind of what you enjoy, the empty calories usually, the higher, more palatable foods, then there's the fewer foods that you can put in that are going to get you. I mean, how are you going to get your 4,700 milligrams of potassium? How are you going to get adequate, iodine in your diet? That's not going to come from just, randomly picking foods that you enjoy but watching macros. It's hard to just watch macros on a 1,500 calorie diet and not become nutrient deficient. Or micronutrient deficient.
I had a time period, I don't know why, but I was trying to lose weight fast, and I dropped my fats to like 30 grams a day.
Yeah.
And it came to a point where I was literally, I was not eating anything real at that point.
Right.
All my cheese
Fat-free cheese.
Fat-free cheese, fat-free Greek yogurt.
All the dairy, fat-free everything.
White fish, chicken breast.
Yeah.
Nothing with fat, nothing.
The Trader Joe desserts that are like, for some reason, made for people who do flexible dieting.
Yeah. And
I think any extreme. I think if you get up north of 70% fat, say, in a keto diet that's not protein focused, or down below 10% carbs or 10% fats, I think there's going to be some problems. Carbs not necessarily so, because they're not essential in the way that fat is, but it will absolutely affect performance. And if you're, again, now I'm talking to 1% of the population that's actually, an athlete that's training, and muscle becomes kind of a priority, and the training session itself becomes a priority. And I fuel training sessions intentionally to make them optimal, because if you don't have the right stimulus, you're going to lose muscle tissue. And that's why I'm a big proponent of keeping carbs in for athletes. Now, if I've got a diabetic individual who's got a problem controlling their appetite, then I'm restricting carbohydrates, because they tend to want to eat more, just ad libitum. Not because I think they're bad for them, as we just discussed with IIFYM, but because controlling appetite and improving compliance with the diet is the priority.
absolutely.
So I never take fats below, say, 0.3 grams per pound. That's probably a minimal, just because I think it's important for health. And I'm a huge proponent of proteins. I'll drive proteins usually at a gram per pound of body weight, which I think is largely being accepted now as necessary, and not even just for athletes, but for the average population. It's really important, and it helps with satiety and the thermic effect of foods, and really helps with dieting. So I'm heavy on protein, but at the same time I want to make sure that those proteins have more nutrients. I'm not just trying to do a protein powder or a tilapia, because I think that you're missing out on all those important nutrients. And if I've got, particularly women, that start suffering from anemia, and their menstrual period starts to shut down, amenorrhea, that's a problem. Now I've got health issues I'm creating so somebody can get a plastic trophy, and that's not anything that I'm trying to promote. So you're right, it's micronutrient dense. The second filter I pour this diet through is digestibility. Obviously, highly bioavailable foods, I like to make sure they're absorbable, but digestibility. And so I've just found that with myself and a lot of my clients, that they tend to have some sort of digestive distress over the years, and all these different diets that they've been trying. And so I lead with a low FODMAP diet. And there's great evidence, great science to show that 60 to 80% of the people that go on a low FODMAP, low fermentable oligo-di monosaccharides and polyol diet can improve symptoms of IBS and IBD, and just decrease bloating and gas. It's not that I need to demonize high FODMAP foods, but I just think that people should be comfortably digesting their food. And I've just found that a lot of, particularly women again, and I also see this a lot in men who are trying to gain weight, that are eating, just pizza, pasta, pancakes, and what have you, is that they're just bloated all the time, but they don't care. They'll clean out a room and they don't care. They laugh about it. It's funny. But if you've been backstage at a bodybuilding show, of women who have been eating egg whites and broccoli, it's pretty miserable, to go back there and see what these people are, or to experience what they're going through inside at the,
Right.
at these shows. And that's been a huge thing. They just, their stomach feels flatter. They just feel better. A lot of times when people are shoveling down tons and tons of high gas fibers just to supposedly satiate you, there's a price to pay for that. And so those are probably the primary things that I look at. On the flip side, and we probably get there when we talk about bodybuilding and powerlifting and strongman kind of stuff, I've been concerned about metabolic syndrome, something that I've experienced throughout my career, having been, having gained weight, gotten up to over 300 pounds many times to be a power lifter. And, friends of mine, Mark Bell, who was 330 pounds, and the powerlifters I work with now, and the strongmen, Hofthor, and he came to me 3 years ago, was 435 pounds. He was, metabolically unhealthy. We ran blood tests and saw that he had elevated blood sugars and had high blood pressure and, a little fatty liver, and those kinds of things not only impair performance, but long-term health. Mm-hmm. And so what I try and do with my diet is have those heavier guys. Obviously, some of it has to do with what I call periodizing their weight, the same way they would their training. I have them drop weight down, but then I give them, instead of just looking at calories in total, I try and give them diets that give them adequate choline, so their fatty liver, we can get in front of that, and then I can bring their blood sugar down and therefore bring their blood pressure down. And then when they bulk back up, they're sensitive, nutrient sensitive, and they're partitioning towards muscle more than fat. And I use the kinds of foods that I think make that easier on them to eat without being all bloated. And I do pull out pizza, pasta, and pancakes. I can't load tons and tons of pasta or bread or brown rice or quinoa into an athlete that has to eat 7,000 calories a day.
That's just like concrete in your stomach.
Yeah.
No, just to interject with that. You do that because of the gluten in the grains, is that correct?
Well, because they could be hard to digest. And I don't think people have celiac. Everybody has celiac. It's a very small percentage of the population. And gluten insensitivity is even controversial. And the same group out of Australia that did the research on celiac disease found that when you blinded people to what they were eating, that they would report symptoms just kind of based on what they were told they were eating as opposed to what they were actually eating. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to demonize grains by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just saying in large quantities, they can be hard to digest.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about dairy and lactose intolerance? Do you think that's other things that are affecting it, or?
A whole host of things I think about that. A lot of people are lactose intolerant. And it's individualistic and it's dose dependent. And so maybe you can handle 4 ounces of milk, but not 8. Mm. Or maybe you could eat yogurt just fine, because it's a little easier to digest, even with lactose in it, because of the probiotics and the fermentation of it. Or maybe even then you go to a cheddar cheese. So I'm looking at dairy as a calcium source, because I think the calcium is important. Mm-hmm. But we're seeing in the research, in most of the meta-analyses, Alan Aragon's posted some great stuff about this, that the populations that consume the most dairy have the best BMI and the longest lifespan. We see the tallest people in the world are the Dutch in the Netherlands, who consume the most dairy. Their number one crop up there is they raise cattle and they sell a ton of cheese and dairy. We see the highest saturated fat consumers in the world. In Switzerland and in France have the lowest heart disease. They eat a lot of cheese. And so there are some good, and there's many other things, when you talk about these population studies, there obviously, there's plenty, there's the healthy user bias, and people who tend to eat healthier tend to weigh less and smoke less and drink less and exercise more. So it's hard to tease out the individual things, but to go direct to your question, if you have lactose intolerance, don't drink milk. If you have a peanut allergy, don't eat peanuts. If you're allergic to shellfish, don't eat shellfish. But that doesn't make it bad for everyone. I'm allergic to vegetable oils, and I come out hard against them, but looking at the research, I can't say that it's terrible for everyone. It causes me gastric distress. It's my particular food that when you're dealing with somebody who has a particular food, it's my trigger. That no matter what I eat it with or on, then I get sick. And so obviously I demonize that, and as would someone who's lactose intolerant. They would say, well, milk's bad for you, and we're the only human or the only animal that consumes the milk of another animal.
Right.
They start making these nonsensical arguments.
So for a client, if they came to you and they had lactose intolerant, you try to make them find something that they can
try and steer them towards a yogurt. And then if that doesn't work, I might steer him for a cheddar cheese. And now if that doesn't work, then we got to try and find him a calcium source.
Right.
He asked because he's
hates
He is
himself.
lactose
But
intolerant.
I can handle
He's that guy.
milk, but I can handle yogurt. I
Yeah.
can't handle yogurt
I
and
throw it in
cheese.
there. And the
Small amounts of
probiotics are
cheese.
valuable, and you know, they're I think that some of the better nutritionists out there are trying to keep some of that in there. I know the carnivore group doesn't like it. They might want to use bone meal or some calcium supplement. I don't like calcium supplements. Some of the research suggests that calcium from dairy improves cardiovascular disease, and calcium from supplements it makes it worse. So I'm kind of concerned, and it's not to say that all supplements are bad, but we saw in the Linus Pauling era with his mega dosing of antioxidants that all these vitamin A's and E's made things worse. They didn't make them better, and that food or vitamins with food, the cofactors that are in there, make it a lot harder to suffer from toxicities than if you were to take the vitamin by itself. It's true of iron and a host of other supplements. So I don't mean to be blathering on in too many directions, but I'm really kind of tried focused first and foremost in creating a foundation for my athletes that give them the nutrients that they need, easily digestible, highly bioavailable, and then from there, we can. I'm not a zealot about. I give them a specific list of foods I want them to start with, and then they can introduce other items that fit their needs, and I'll just ask them, let's see how you feel. Kind of like an elimination / reintroduction type diet. And that would be similar. I've had clients I put on the carnivore diet. Their digestion has been so bad, and they've reacted to so many things that I just tell them you get steak and egg yolks for the first 30 days to see if we can get the symptoms to subside. And then we'll start reintroducing, which is how an elimination diet works.
I think that it's interesting that the vertical diet has become so popular now and so widespread that it's gotten to the point where people who aren't really doing it almost think they're doing it. Like, it's just been, people associate certain foods now with doing the
Like,
vertical
I eat
diet.
beef and rice. I'm freaking vertical, man.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you'll see some guy loading up,
And they're not getting any of the other micronutrients and stuff that you preach
they
about.
possibly can, that their cart's full of it. And I'm like, oh man, you're going to be having 300 grams of fat per meal with what you just loaded in there.
You go to Waffle House, get a glass of orange juice. You're like, oh,
It's
Vertical.
Right.
Vertical.
And it's a 12-ounce glass of orange juice, not a 3-ounce glass. I'm pretty cautious about the recommendations I make. I'm not a big believer that fructose is particularly nasty for you. I think sugar in excess of 100 grams can hit the liver pretty hard, but 12 grams, is not going to have the same kind of impact. And none of this is new. I don't claim to have invented this. I think it's sensible. I always say it's simple, sensible, and sustainable. Vince Gironda was talking about this stuff in the 60s. And what concerns me most is how far we've gotten away from these core foods that are so valuable, particularly for athletes or for health. And we've gone through this era where we've demonized so many different things that we've got people suffering from these deficiencies. Vince Gironda was talking about steak. He was talking about whole eggs. He even was talking about sea kelp. I've promoted iodine pretty heavily for the last many years, and people have been using sea salts and pink salts. There's no iodine in those. Now you've got women who are training for competitions and sweating every day, suffering from hypothyroidism because they have no iodine in their diet. And so I asked, do you specifically have an iodine source in your diet? Where are you getting it from? If you've taken out egg yolks, you've taken out dairy, those are, not rich sources, but some of the sources that that you can get some iodine from. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a source in there. So those things are important. And, as I rolled this out, I also took the time. I take it, I feel like I have a sense of responsibility to my clients and to the general population that may not work directly with me, to put out good information. We're influencers. We have a large audience, and people will listen to us. And so, I've spent my whole life studying this and competing, and I've tried to put out a good message. My ongoing education has been, to attend lots of other, and to watch and attend lots of other professionals in the industry. Obviously, I went to the Barbell Medicine Seminar last year. I think those guys are extraordinary.
Yeah, they did one at our gym.
Yeah, they're fantastic. And Ripito, I'm a member of, I've been reading Greg Knuckles' research for a couple of years now since he put out his stuff. Obviously, subscribe to Alan Oregon's stuff and read his. Eric Trexler with Greg Knuckles. Read just about everything that Lane Norton puts out. I bought RP Strength's book and read it. I took the NSCA's CSCS last year. I'm still learning more now than probably, I know more now certainly than when I was competing 5-6 years ago. And I took the extra step of recruiting a partner, a co-author in the Vertical Diet, who's a registered dietitian with a PhD in exercise phys, who was head of the dietetic department for UNLV and was also head of the Southern Nevada Dietetic Association. So, I've worked closely. We went through our entire diet and we put 200 references to peer-reviewed published literature just to make sure that this thing was healthy and was safe and was effective at the same time. Again, trying to match both the academics, the book stuff with the application, the experience stuff from myself and from my athletes. And so we think it's really solid. It's occasionally somebody who hasn't read it will go through and comment on what they heard about, like we just talked about.
My favorite one's salt. Can you touch on that briefly?
Salt's extraordinary.
You got to tell the story about the meat.
Even myself, I went to a powerlifting meet and I woke up in the morning and I was sucking down tons of Gatorade, which is loaded with sugar and very little sodium in comparison. And I ended up cramping really bad at the meet. I got done with the squat and I was benching and my hands were squeezing the bar so hard my forearms had cramped up that I was actually having to pry my fingers off the bar. And in between sets I was having to sit there and rest my hands like this so they wouldn't lock up. And then eventually the quads and the hamstrings. And so I was going to I had my wife ask her to go get my keys so I could go to the hospital. I thought I was going to have to get a saline bag or something before I started to lock up. And instead she went and got Mark and Jesse and they brought over tons of Nun tablets and just started loading me full of sodium. And I probably had, 15 or 20 Nun tablets over the next half an hour with water. And eventually my body started to relax and calm down. I was able to finish the bench. I still got 600 that day. And then by the time the deadlift came, I felt like a new man. I mean, my warm-up deadlift came off the floor like it was just nothing. Probably stronger than I'd felt in months. Because I was training in Sacramento. It was 90 degrees that year, and I was sweating a lot. And so I suffered through, I think, a lot of dehydration. Since that time, I was helping Larry Wheels get ready for a show, and he didn't do his refeed. He went, when you cut water to make weight, you lose a lot of sodium, and instead he went to IHOP to refeed.
Oh no!
And so, sure enough, he gets to the meet and hadn't had enough sodium, and he started same experience, started cramping up. And then somebody came over to do some massage on his forearms because he was cramping up. And I'm like, no, that's not going to work. So we started loading him up with sodium and did the same thing. And he was able to finish that meet and set a record. So I scream from the rooftops as often as I can about the importance of sodium for athletes. I work with Lane Johnson from the Philadelphia Eagles, and he's a salty sweater. He's a level 5 sweater. Dr. Godick from the Heat Institute tests the Philadelphia Eagles. They put a patch test on them to look at their sweat rate. It was something that I had them send to Ben Smith when I was working with him he was a CrossFit national champion that I worked with, and he had suffered from heat stroke about a month before regionals one year. And so I reached out to Godick's group. I think it's important to say here that all the information that I put out comes from, I think it comes from somebody, a professional in the field that validates the effectiveness. I always reach out to authorities in the field, and Dr. Godick is probably one of the best known thermoregulation hydration specialists who runs the Heat Institute. And I read her stuff, and then when I had a question in a serious case like Ben's, I reached out to them. I called them, and they gave me a protocol for him. And then they also gave me sweat tests for Brian Shaw, and for Hofthor, so that we could implement these hydration protocols for them. Again, I'm not a guru. I didn't invent this stuff. I'm supposed to help my clients. I want to get as much information as I can from the best people that I'm able to have access to, and then give them that information, hopefully improve their performance. So when I talk about these things, I'm not pretending like I invented it. I just think it's the best information. My ebook, all of these people are in there. All the names I just mentioned, they're in there with links to their literature, their videos, their articles, saying if you want to know more about this kind of thing or where I got the information, these are the people, these are the professionals in the field. I kind of facilitate, the information that I learn to my clients. the sodium thing was huge for us, and that got me to start to talk about sodium in terms of its benefits. And then, of course, Dr. D. Nicolantonio's book, The Salt Fix, took a deep dive into that and went through how important it is. And then you look at people like Dr. Aaron Carroll from Healthcare Triage, he's the Dean of Research for Indiana, and he's an MD. And he talks about the fact that the supposed evidence for sodium restriction is slim to none.
In terms of CHF, or
in terms of even heart patients, even people who've had cardiovascular disease, restricting sodium below 3 grams per day can increase their all-cause mortality. And so we came up with some recommendations. They're consistent with that of the ISSN, the International Society of Sports Nutrition. They're consistent with that of the NSCA. To salt your meals to taste, consistent with Dr. Godek's recommendations, and then to take 500 milligrams of sodium before and after training. Now, I adjust that accordingly. If I got a 400-pound athlete, or if somebody's in a humid climate, or Camille LeBlanc when she was at CrossFit at the Reebok Championships this year, last year we did 1,000 milligrams before and after some of the longer events, and that was the first year that over the course of the 5 days of events that she gained a pound. She didn't lose weight, and so that was huge for her in terms of her energy and performance. So, salt's huge. Those are my recommendations. I put them in the diet. Just salt meals to taste. I prefer to use an iodized salt if people don't have an iodine source, like cranberry juices, which what I recommend because it's so rich in iodine. Just 3 ounces of it is 300% of your daily RDA. That probably of all the things that I think are life-changing, that I get feedback from athletes and clients all over the world, is when they start to salt their food again, because they've demonized it to the point where they don't put salt on anything.
Right.
And if you've ever had a client get up from a leg press and complain about being dizzy, that's a salt problem. And you can fix that in 5 minutes by having them pop 500 milligrams of sodium, which is a 1/4 teaspoon of salt before a workout. And we recommend it before and after now. You see, John Meadows talks a lot about intra-workout hydration, intra, and post, and sodium's part of that. It really helps with recovery, obviously stamina endurance for the workout itself, but it delays or it improves delayed onset muscle soreness following workouts. That's why they say to take it before and after. So that's huge. I harp on about that, but it's life-changing.
Is there an amount that's too much? Because I like that you made the distinction to salt and to taste, because the personality that some of that even powerlifters that I know have, it's like all they need to hear is Stan said salt is good, and all of a sudden they're buying salt by the shipping
If
container.
one is good, 10 is better. That's what we do. Here's the thing. If you overdose on salt, then for lack of a better way to describe it, you'll piss it out your ass. Your body will suck water into your stomach and expel it, like getting salt water in the ocean. So, no, more isn't better. And my own training partner did that when I told him about salt.
Same.
He's like, I'm not going to make it to the workout
Marcus?
today.
No, it was back when I was doing CrossFit.
Yeah.
I was like, hey, I started adding some to my intra-workout drink because we would train all day and we wouldn't eat as much. So I'm trying to get calories through like a liquid means. And he's like, he's a funny guy. He's a French guy.
Yeah.
And he can be a little bit like hard-headed sometimes.
Right.
So he saw me add a little bit and he thought, oh, if he's adding a little bit, I'm going to add more and I'm going to get a competitive advantage.
Yeah.
And he adds more, and like 20 minutes into the workout, he's like, hold on, I got to stop. I was like, you don't ever stop training. Like, what are you talking about? And he runs into the bathroom.
Yeah, that's what happens. So if you're deficient in something and you remedy that deficiency, you see a significant improvement in performance. But if you megadose, there's not many examples where you get additional benefit.
Right.
And in many cases, there's probably a detriment. So your tongue will tell you, actually, is what Dr. Godek talks about, that you'll it's not like sugar. You won't just keep adding more and more and more. Your body will continue to want what it needs, and then eventually it'll regulate that for you. So
Interesting.
that's the goal, is to get enough so that you perform better. And it's based generally on its efficiency, especially for women. They tend to do really well in terms of that lightheadedness.
Stan, can we? I would love for my mom to listen to this podcast. So this question's for her. Can we briefly talk about the correlation between red meat and cardiovascular disease, and kind of what's been the most recent research on it?
Yeah, and I'm not the expert on that. I defer to some people who've done some great work on that. Alan Oregon's done a great job on that. Lane Norton's done a great job on that, and debunking the Game Changers movie in particular, which I've got vegan clients, I've vegetarian clients, and I'm all about eating vegetables so long as you tolerate them. But the problem is when you start demonizing such an important food as red meat, especially for women because of the iron and the B12. I think that you do a disservice to people, and that's not to say that you should eat all red meat all day. I think you need a gram of protein per pound of body weight, and it should consist of a whole egg, and it should consist of a little bit of dairy. It should consist of some fatty fish like salmon, and it should consist of some red meat. And you can throw some chicken in there, a piece of pork. All of that is fair game, but to demonize red meat on the basis of some of this horrific epidemiological research, and a lot of this pouring out of, for the last 40 years out of Harvard in particular, is all epidemiology. And Dr. Ioannidis is probably considered the godfather of meta-research, has come out over the last few years and written plenty of articles and made statements saying that, look, this is garbage research. This epidemiology is complete garbage. The confidence in levels with some of this correlation to heart disease is so small, and it's absolutely affected by that healthy user bias again. People who tend to eat more red meat also tend to smoke more, drink more, weigh more, and exercise less. And people who tend to eat more vegetables tend to be more health conscious people that weigh less, smoke less, drink less, and exercise more. And they've done plenty of research where they've gone into say Whole Foods, and they've taken groups of people who are generally health conscious people. They're in Whole Foods, they're generally health conscious. And they divided them by those who ate primarily vegetables and those who ate more meat. And they found they had equivalent health outcomes. And I think the most recent study, what was it, the NHANES, I might be naming it wrong, there's so much spinning around in my head, but it was the most recent study that came out where they suggested that you shouldn't adjust your meat intake because these correlations, these epidemiology studies, didn't have a high confidence interval for adverse health outcomes. So you see a lot of people coming out now. You've got the carnivore diet with Paul Saladino and Dr. Sean Baker. And I'm not advocating for a carnivore diet, but I'm also not seeing where they're wrong in making the recommendations that they make, particularly for people who may have autoimmune disorders, or we talked earlier about elimination diets for people with severe gastrointestinal disorders or IBS or IBD. They've seen a lot of success with that. So I don't think it's anything for anybody to worry about. And to take that one step further, even the difference between, say, grass finished and grain finished beef. People, I think it was even Rob Wolf who did the paleo solution in his second book, said that was probably the biggest mistake he made, was demonizing grain finished. They're all weaned on their mother's milk, fed grass throughout the majority of their life. Some are grain finished and some are grass finished. And the major difference between the two is their omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, but there's such a small content that's not where you'd go for your omegas. You'd go get a piece of salmon that's 200 times the amount of EPA and DHA than beef. It's just certain places that you look for certain things.
Do you think it's important to vary your protein sources? Like, will you tell people to mostly eat red meat, or do you want them having salmon and chicken and other things sometimes?
I want all of them. I want the EPA and DHA. I want 2 grams a day. You can get that from 2 5-ounce servings of salmon a week. I definitely want the calcium, the benefits from dairy. I also really like the research on dairy, particularly for athletes. I love seeing what it does for adolescents. When you look at the Dutch studies, I like seeing what it does for calcium and body composition. So I do like to get some dairy in there if it's tolerable, if you have to go to a yogurt or a cheddar cheese. I think some variety is good because they have different vitamins. The eggs in particular, I think the egg yolk is extraordinary. That should be kept in there. They've done research. They've taken 2 groups of men that were weightlifting, hypertrophy. This is men over 50 in this particular study. And they equated for protein between egg white consumers and whole egg consumers. And they found that the whole egg consumers, and they were eating equivalent amounts of protein, and they were both hypertrophy training or strength training, or a combination of the two. The group that ate the whole eggs had measurable improvement in hypertrophy and significantly better strength outcomes than the group that ate the egg whites. Wow. And they ate the same amount of protein.
That's interesting. And
the conclusion was, or at least the authors of the study concluded, that the micronutrients mattered. As we kind of started out this conversation, they matter. And so that's kind of why I don't lead with supplements that say protein powders. Protein's important, macros are important, but I don't lead with that because they're devoid of micronutrients. I lead with whole foods, eating whole foods first. So yeah, I do like a variety. I wouldn't just push red meat all day long. Although, as elimination diets go, if you are really concerned about your digestive health or you have autoimmune disorders that are, for many people can be very debilitating, you have to start with something. And the most nutrient dense food is going to be like a ribeye steak or a New York steak. That's what you can start with. If you tried to eliminate anything else, if you eliminated that and tried to eat any other single food, kale, acai berry, what you name a food, celery shakes, name a food that everybody thinks is a superfood, and you would die in a week trying to consume that. Whereas with meat, you can get, as much of everything that you need. I certainly wouldn't recommend that for the long term, although many people thrive on that, just meat and eggs. But I'm just saying, in terms of nutrient density, that's for me, that's a place to start. And it's a what they call a low residue food. And so if you're going to go in and get a colonoscopy, the doctor tells you not to eat high residue foods because so red meat's one of those that's digested almost entirely before it gets through the small intestine. I think Joe Rogan recently talked about how he had diarrhea for the first 2 weeks doing the carnivore diet because he had an imbalance of water in the large intestine.
Sure.
His body was used to having more roughage, and then it after a while it balanced itself out after a couple of weeks, and he was normal. But then he experienced a lot less bloating. He was kind of called out. I think I saw a video where somebody called out Joe for having distension, and they were trying to surmise that was from growth hormone usage. And whether or not he's using GH is irrelevant. But if you're eating a bunch of foods that cause your intestines to expand and bloat, then that's certainly going to cause that problem. And as it turns out, after the month on the carnivore diet, his stomach was a lot flatter. And that's what I've experienced with my clients who use the low FODMAP diet, is that they don't have all the gas and bloating, and they just feel better.
So like all of us here, we were pretty familiar with the vertical diet, but for our listeners, let's say you had a 200-pound male that his goal is to get bigger and stronger, whatever it may be. What does a day of vertical eating typically, without getting too specific, look like for someone like that?
If it's hard for them to consume, again, we set up a hierarchy, right? What's the most important thing he eats in a calorie surplus? Calories are king. He's got to eat in a surplus. What if he's having a hard time eating in a surplus, which is what I run into with some of my big athletes, is that just eating enough is the primary problem to solve.
Extremely hard.
It's hard. Yeah,
it's very hard.
Well, plus the fact that once you eat in a surplus, just like women and men who are dieting experience metabolic adaptation, their metabolism slows a bit from calorie deficits. People who eat in calorie surpluses will experience metabolic adaptation in the other direction. You might eat 500 extra calories and find you're not gaining weight, but because your BMR increased and you're burning the calories. So now you have to eat another 300 or 400 on top of that just to gain weight. So after calories, I look at the macro content, and protein in particular, highly satiating, high thermic effective food. You get fewer net calories out of protein. For every 100 calories you eat, you might only net out 70. Not good for a guy who's trying to gain weight. And back when I was in college in my early 20s, I used to think that the more protein I ate, the more mass I would build. Turns out just the opposite happened. I tried to suck down 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight, and it just cranked on my hamster wheel so fast that I couldn't gain weight. But I was hot all the time. I couldn't wear covers at night, and I had to roll down the window in the middle of winter when I was driving down the street in the car. That's what happens. And so now we've seen this in protein overfeeding studies by Dr. Jose Antonio from the ISSN. It's really hard to eat too much protein. And it's really hard to gain weight when you are eating more protein. They do these overfeeding studies where I think they increased 800 calories, and they used the 3 different macronutrients. And those who ate 800 calories more of protein didn't gain weight. Those who ate 800 calories more of fat and carbs did. So I bring protein down as a result. I'll bring it down to 0.8 grams per pound. And it sounds counterintuitive for a guy who's trying to gain muscle, but it actually works for a number of reasons, because it gives them the appetite to eat in a surplus. Plus, the carbohydrates are protein sparing. And so, and they'll protect muscle tissue breakdown. Everybody talks about muscle protein synthesis as a priority, but muscle protein breakdown is something to focus on as well. And if you have less catabolism, obviously you have more room for anabolism. So that's how I start out with calories and macros, and then I dive into the actual types of foods. And the easiest foods to eat are going to be those low FODMAP foods. And so rather than using, say, there's foods that are high satiety. This is another thing that I utilize with dieters. I give them high satiety foods, a potato, an orange. Those are on the top of the list in terms of the satiety index for how long a certain food will keep them full or feeling full. So I won't put those foods in there. I'll use a low satiety food. So I use a little bit of orange juice. Increases their body temperature and their metabolism, just like 3 ounces with each meal. So part of my improving your appetite method I have in the diet, I put, I think 14 tips. I did a video on it as well on how to improve your appetite. And I talk about how certain foods will make you hungrier more often. You can eat more of them. So I get their protein sources in. Again, I'm primarily using a lean red meat. I don't like to go too high in fats for people who are trying to gain mass because I want to fuel that workload with carbohydrates. So they might still only take in 0.3, 0.4 grams of fats. And those are usually in your meat, in your egg, in your dairy. They're already there, so you don't have to add any. And now we're on to carbohydrates. And the carbs I'll choose, it would be a little bit of orange juice. You get a little bit of lactose from the yogurt. And now we're white rice. I can't put, again, pizza, pasta, pancakes in these people. I can't put high FODMAP foods, brown rice, quinoa, stuff like that. It has to be easily digestible. And a couple of tricks that I use is with the white rice is I'll have them sprinkle a little bit of dextrose on the white rice.
Delicious.
Oh, it's phenomenal.
Yeah.
And it's not really to drive calories. It's mostly to improve appetite. Plus, what we found is that some people have a hard time digesting starches. They don't get as much amylase production out of the pancreas. And so when you put a little dextrose on the rice, not only do you get more amylase production in the mouth and more saliva, so it makes it easier to eat. You can start funneling down tons and tons of rice because the little bit of dextrose just makes it more moist. But now you're getting more pancreatic release of amylase as well. And so it's digesting better in the stomach, so you get less bloating. So they can eat more of it more often. So I'm using it for that purpose, not necessarily for its caloric content.
As you're learning a lot more, have you changed the vertical diet at all since the base? Like, are you coming out with like a 2.0 or anything?
I did. Matter of fact, we're already on the 3.0 version. So originally I came out 3 years ago with the vertical diet, and then I did the vertical diet 2.0, and now I'm on the vertical diet 3.0. One of the neat things about doing a username and password access diet is that I can update it ongoing. Mm-hmm. And all of my clients who'd previously bought any of the other versions, they get the updates for free. And then as I learn things, we talked about a collaboration between clients. You know, every client that you have, you learn something from them, especially these great athletes that you get the chance to talk to. And I learned as much from them as they did from me throughout this process over the years. So I'll add it. If somebody asks me a question, I don't have the answer, or if it's not in the vertical diet, I'll add it to the vertical diet. So the next time they log in, it's there. So we've put a lot of things in there, food lists and grocery shopping lists and links to certain things I recommend, such as the CPAP, or on Amazon, the thermos was a great tool that we use so people can have hot meals and be prepared. So all of those things go in there.
I think a lot more people need CPAPs than are using them.
I think so. And it's really hard overseas because when you have socialized medicine, my clients come to me from Canada or from Australia or from Europe. It takes a long time to get in to be seen. And then if you don't have severe sleep apnea, then they're just telling you to lose weight. Mm-hmm. Well, my bodybuilders, powerlifters, and strongmen don't want to lose weight. And the problem is that the it's not just that you're tired, you know, your low oxygen levels are going to impair recovery, but also blood pressure is huge. There can be a 20-point increase. This is one of the biggest things that Hofthor realized immediately when he started using a CPAP. Yep. And Lane Johnson from the Eagles, he started using a CPAP and his systolic blood pressure dropped like 14 points. Mm.
Wow.
Same.
Now, if you're salt sensitive, if you're hypertensive, and there are people out there, and you asked about, I think earlier, about how much sodium. I think it was. I don't think I wrapped up the tail end of that conversation. There's a small percentage of the population that's hypertensive. They're salt sensitive, and they've got high blood pressure. And if they take in too much sodium, they can realize an increase in systolic blood pressure. Well, that's been measured in many studies to be between 2 and 5 millimeters. Now, I just said that CPAP could bring your systolic blood pressure down by 20 millimeters. So what's a more significant intervention? Mm-hmm. The same thing's true with thyroid function. Women who have been studied who are hypothyroid as compared to normothyroid can have a 20-point difference in systolic blood pressure. So that's a much more important intervention than, say, sodium restriction, which can be adversely affect them. Right. And it's only going to raise blood pressure in those who are hypertensive. Now, of those hypertensives, if you get adequate potassium, 4,700 milligrams a day, that increase in systolic blood pressure goes away. So I think the range is between about 3 to 6 grams. Over 6 grams a day of sodium, which is about 14 grams of salt. Mind you, it's sodium chloride, so it's 40% sodium, 60% chloride. So when I say sodium, between 3 and 6 grams, I'm saying salt between with about 7 and 14 grams. Is considered to be a safe range. And this was from the PEER study. This is Dr. Salim Youssef, who's a cardiologist, head of the World Heart Federation out of Canada, has done significant research in the most recent, largest trial, epidemiology trial that's ever been done. Beyond 6 grams, only hypertensive have an adverse response to sodium, and then they can be remedied with some potassium intervention. But I'm not recommending that a sedentary, elderly, hypertensive individual eat cans of Pringles or salt their food. I'm talking about athletes here. That's generally who I'm, but not just athletes, even your soccer mom who's suffering from lightheadedness and dizziness because she's over-restricted salt and may even have some thyroid issues because along with salt comes iodine in many cases because the CDC put it in our table salt, in the 20s. So all of that I think is huge. You see, I'm so passionate. I want to try and get it all out there because
I love it.
It's never any one thing. We've talked about at least a half a dozen or more different things that I think it's an orchestra, and you have to put them all together to get the great benefits from it.
There's one other thing I wanted to touch on. I don't know how much time we have. I want to be conscious of your time as well.
Sure.
But you personally have experience competing at the highest level in both bodybuilding and powerlifting, and you work with both performance athletes and professional dieters, as you were saying earlier. How do you change the plan between those two, or is there much difference at all in the way you get them to eat?
I've said this, and I've put Hafthor Bjornsson next to 100-pound Tiny Tiff. You've got 450-pound Hafthor Bjornsson next to 103-pound Tiny Tiff. They're on the same diet. I work with the professional ballet dancer from the Sacramento Ballet Company. She's on the same diet. In terms of the foundation, those are those micronutrient dense foods that are easy to consume, highly bioavailable, low FODMAP. A whole egg, a little bit of red meat, a little bit of dairy, an iodine source, low gas vegetables, spinach and squash and those kinds of things, a piece of salmon a week. It's really fundamental. It's about the same. And then I drive calories, like we discussed with the weight gain recommendation, based on workload. Even a CrossFitter who's training twice a day is going to demand significantly more calories than your dad bod. They're going to have the same foundation. But I'm driving those calories, generally speaking. That's when the white rice comes in, simply to fuel workload, a very efficient source of energy to fuel training. So that's kind of the only difference. And even when I'm dieting people, unless they've got insulin resistance and an appetite problem, I keep carbs in because all of my dieters, I want them to work out. I want them to lift weights as a priority over cardiovascular training. And if those people are familiar with my diet, I don't implement cardio per se. I do 3 10-minute walks a day. I do it with Nadia White, who's competing on the Olympia stage.
Blew up too.
Hafthor Bjornsson.
Yeah, the 10-minute walks.
Hafthor's doing 10-minute walks religiously. He just shot a video the other day. He's at the Hilton and he ate. And the first thing that he did is he went and took a 10-minute walk. And that's what's really improved his insulin sensitivity. He got a 445-pound guy now who's, and I say this all the time, his fasted glucose was 83. And those who are familiar with that number knows that anything under 100 is considered healthy. 83 is extraordinary, particularly for a guy that's that big. His HA1C is 5.3. 5.7 and above is pre-diabetic, and I think above 6.4 is diabetic. And his insulin is less than 6. Insulin range is usually, I think it's like 3 to 24. It should be less than 6. Otherwise, that's kind of the canary in the coal mine. And once your insulin starts climbing, then you're looking at high triglycerides and potentially, cardiovascular problems. So and I look at blood sugars primarily because they're significant for appetite for weight loss people. I have obese clients that have insulin that's 17, 19, 20. Those people, you're going to have a hard time controlling their appetite. And a lot of this comes from experience. Like you said, I've been over 300 pounds and I've been down to 4% body fat on a bodybuilding stage. I know what it's like to lose a ton of mass and strength dieting on restrictive egg whites and chicken breast and doing 2 hours of cardio a day. I've done that many times throughout my career. I know what it's like to get metabolic syndrome from bulking up to over 300 pounds, doing go mad and pizza pasta pancakes every night before bed. I know what that's like. And I had blood tests throughout my career on a monthly basis, over 150 blood tests for at least the last 12 or 14 years. And so I saw what that did to my blood sugars, to my blood pressure, to my kidney and liver enzymes. I watched that happen real time. And then I kept trying to implement things over the years, working with numerous doctors at times to see how I could fix that, because the healthier I was, the better I performed. At times when I was over 300 pounds and I was a little bit unhealthy, I wasn't even as strong as I was at 272. I was stronger, 30 pounds lighter, but I was, metabolically, I was healthier. So I watch all of those things. And that's kind of why I make the recommendations I make, because I see what's going on the inside. It's kind of where we started in this conversation, is that you see a bikini girl on stage that doesn't tell the story. I work with Stephanie Sanzo, Steph Fitmum from Australia. Extraordinary athlete, and I've got a before and after picture of her where we were training or working together, and you don't see too much difference. Discerning eye can see that she got a little harder, but she's always been in fantastic shape. But what people don't see is that she used to eat under 1,200 calories a day. She used to do 2 40-minute cardio sessions a day. She had intermittent water retention issues, and she would have to use some over-the-counter diuretics every now and then just to appear at an expo. Brain fog, fatigue. Low thyroid, all those problems, B12 deficiency. And then after working together for a short period of time, all of a sudden she's eaten 1,800 calories. She's got carbs back in her diet. She's taking 3 10-minute walks, and she's got more energy, and she feels better. Her skin's better, more strength. So all of those things happen just as a result of changing the types of foods that she eats and letting her sleep and not over cardioing her, which can have really significant adverse effects on the amount of muscle mass you retain and your energy levels and fatigue, obviously.
You touched on it in a couple different ways. About one earlier, you said just fixing things you have deficiencies in can obviously create immediate improvements in performance and how you feel. And then you also just touched on how you had a lot of blood tests over the course of your career. Do you think that's something that's overkill for Gen Pop or for just weekend warrior type people, or is that something everyone should be doing?
I disagree with, and I've learned a lot from a lot of people, and I don't agree with everything all of them say, but I've learned a lot. The folks at Barbell Medicine, Austin Baraki and Jordan Fagenbaum, I think are some of the leading guys in terms of the medical portion of this when it comes to blood tests. They don't recommend blood tests. They think that people, that it might just be unnecessary or overkill. It's like in some cases with, as Steffi knows, you don't want to define people by certain ailments. If they go get an MRI all of a sudden and it shows some sort of, spinal abnormality, then they'll define themselves as that. And they might become kinesiophobic and start avoiding certain exercises, et cetera, as a result. Same thing with blood tests. You're worried about noceboing people, But I tend to disagree in that I do deal with a lot of athletes and a lot of athletes who use performance-enhancing drugs. And under those circumstances in particular, I think it's important that they get a blood test to look at those kinds of things. I want to see their liver, and I want to see their kidneys, and I want to see their blood pressure and all of those things. But even in the normal population, here's where I recommend it. If you implement a program, and I should say this, that almost irrespective of what the blood test says, you're going to implement a lot of the same things anyhow. Hey, improve your sleep, take a few walks, improve your diet, lift some weights. You're going to make many of the same recommendations. If I get an athlete, and I say this to trainers in particular, if you've worked with a client for 30 to 60 days and they haven't gotten the results they want, and they're paying you money and they're in the gym busting their ass and they're not seeing, weight loss results, or if they're not gaining lean muscle mass, like if it's a man and they're lifting weights and they're not getting any stronger after 60 days, they might be hypogonadal, which is a bigger problem than just gaining muscle. We know that it increases all-cause mortality, erectile dysfunction, depression, all those fatigue, all those kinds of things, body composition. That would be a good time as a trainer to recommend that they go in and get a blood test and see if they are hypogonadal. Again, the biggest causes are sleep apnea, low thyroid. Those are huge causes for, I see this with firemen in their 20s that come to me with testosterone of 150. They don't sleep very well. And that's the biggest problem. And with a woman, if you've gone through 30 or 60 days of training a woman and she's paying you money and she's coming to the gym and she's sweating and she's working hard, and we know that 99% of the time it's they're overeating. We know that without passing blame or judging anyone, but we know that generally speaking, they're over consuming calories, and that's certainly a great place to start. But if after 60 days they haven't experienced the results, haven't lost the weight, still have fatigue and tired, then I think they should get a blood test, find out if they're hypothyroid. And maybe they might need supplementation for that.
It's just another thing you can kind of check off and say it's not that, and put the accountability back on someone.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people like to make it, they use, well, I got told once upon a time I have low thyroid, so that's why I can't do X, Y, or Z.
Well, and here's another thing too. People may use hypothyroidism as an excuse. The difference in your metabolism might only be 100. It's negligible. Might only be 100 calories a day. You look at the stuff that Dr. Nadolsky from RP Strength will put out often to say, look, that may very well be true, but it's probably not, moving the needle as much as you think. That if you want to apply Occam's razor, the chances are that we're over consuming calories because we're terrible at estimating it. And that's why I promote on such a big level that you weigh food or that you use meal prep. That's what the bodybuilding figure physique bikini industry does extraordinarily well. They walk around with Tupperwares with pre-weighed stuff. And I know there's this big fraction in the dieting community between people who recommend calorie counting and weighing and people who say, just eat steak and eggs and you'll not have to weigh your food. Even my good friend Mark Bell is like, you don't have to track calories. And that might work, for some people some of the time, but I think they call it intuitive eating. And I always say, if you got somebody that comes to your gym or your CrossFit box and they've never trained before, you don't tell them to go over there and intuitively train.
I think
there's a learning curve.
Exactly. It requires experience. It requires years of tracking for you to be able to not track and know how much you need to consume.
Kind of
right?
As a society, your intuition sucks. That's why there's an obesity epidemic.
Oh, we underestimate calories by over 50%, as do restaurants. Registered dietitians underestimate calories by 20 to 30%. Labels are off by 20 to 30%. It's really hard to trust. So you find there are some practices that work. Obviously, meal prep works. And then in terms of appetite, it seems that when you eat the same thing consistently, people tend to eat less. This is the research from the Weight Control Registry. Those people tend to eat less. In terms of ad libitum, people eating just according to the way they feel, there are a few things that works. Intermittent fasting tends to decrease the amount of hunger. Decreasing carbs tends to decrease hunger. That's why some of those diets can be effective for that reason, not because they're magic for any other reason. People tend to eat a little less just because they tend to be less hungry. Sleeping more tends to decrease hunger because you're not awake as many hours and there's less ghrelin being released, which stimulates hunger. So there's a host of different things that I like to toss in there as tools that people can use. But I don't presume to think that any of them, including the vertical diet, is the only path to the destination. I've said there's many paths to the same destination, and you have to find out what works for your client, because ultimately compliance is the science, and the best diet's the one that they'll follow.
I think I wanted to touch on something real quick. I think one of the things, like I'm really big on big picture takeaways and ways that our listeners can kind of translate the main message of what we're saying. And I think one of the big misconceptions in the fitness community, athlete community as a whole, is this idea that they're different from everybody else and that, we don't have to do the same things that normal people do. We're doing this different goal or this different practice, so we're kind of an outlier. And I think that's a big misconception because it doesn't matter who you are as far as an athlete or a lifter or whatever you're doing. What you need as a human being as far as nutrients go stays the same. You still need all of these certain nutrients in your diet in order for your body to function optimally.
Even more. You're an athlete. We find that athletes, as a percentage, have a higher percentage of athletes are deficient in iodine, magnesium, things they sweat out, sodium, and they need even more. You look, it's kind of an inverse U-shaped curve, sedentary people in terms of their exposure to illness. They have a greater exposure to illness than active people. Athletes have a greater exposure to illness than sedentary people. Sure. Because they're putting themselves in a deficiency position. They're stressing their body to the point where if they don't get if they don't repair that and rest well enough, then they're going to be subject to those kinds of problems, just the common cold and things like that.
The more you use your body, needs of those nutrients increase, need for calories potentially increase, but that doesn't mean that you're exempt from eating, vegetables. It doesn't mean you're exempt from eating this or eating that. Like
those extra calories are an opportunity for you to put stuff in your body that's going to benefit you.
And that being an athlete and achieving a high level performance doesn't mean you need to venture away from health. Health is always the foundation with which you are able to achieve that peak level of performance. Because if you do not have that foundation of health, then it's not going to be very long before you get sidelined for some type of digestive issue, some type of fatigue issue. Your performance comes to a standstill. You should still be chasing health in terms of how you feel, what your lab values look like, sleep, the variation in your diet. You should still be chasing all those things if you're trying to get extremely strong, or if you're trying to get an extreme level of endurance, or whatever your goal is. That doesn't exempt you from trying to be a healthy person. And 100% of the time, trying to be a healthy person and chase normalcy in those values and in your lifestyle is going to promote a higher level of performance.
Yeah. I found that practitioners sometimes are the worst. You heard of nurses syndrome, where they get into nursing school and they think they have every malady, right? Oh, I've got cancer. They read the symptoms and all of a sudden they've got everything and they want to get tested. And I'm that way. I'm a hypochondriac. I've had, sonogram on my organs, and I've had CAC, coronary artery calcification, you name it, all the blood tests. Every test you can imagine I've had, MRI on my hips and knees and what have you. And I've been told, you need hip replacement surgery. And all I needed was a couple of months with a good practitioner, Mark Philippi, to bring me back to health without getting cut on. But I worked with some registered dietitians who are high-level competitors, who are some of the most restrictive people out there, and can't figure out why they're so weak and tired. And it's because they, like we started the conversation, they start demonizing certain foods. They won't eat red meat, they won't eat dairy, they won't eat fruit, they won't salt their food. That's a recipe for disaster. If you want to look at what I think, the fundamentals are for any athlete, I think all of those things are hugely important.
Well, I think you've done a phenomenal job at dissecting the evidence and the research and presenting it in a way that's easy to understand and easy to follow. I think it's amazing. I hope that our listeners, some people that weren't familiar with you and the vertical diet, were able to take home those key important messages and apply it, even if it challenges what their current beliefs are, because I think that's the most difficult part about what we do, right? Is that we're challenging what mainstream belief is, and some people might not like that. It's difficult for people to change the way that they think.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean you're telling me I should be eating something nutrient dense and not Pop-Tarts to fill my macros?
Well, and that's why the links in the literature and the references that we all discussed are in there. I want them to have an opportunity to take a deeper dive and to access, where did you get this information? Obviously, I applied it, and I feel successfully so for myself as an athlete and for my athletes. But that's not to say that's the only way, but at least they could see it. And then I've got I did a seminar in Iceland. I mentioned, just Google Iceland Stan Efferding. I suppose it's the Completus seminar or something like that. It's got over 4 million views. It goes through the whole thing step by step. You don't have to buy my ebook. I give out a lot of free information. It's just that, I compiled it so I could give to my clients, and then people who want a really simple step by step with all of the references, it's in there.
If they wanted to hire you as a coach, where can they find you?
Everything's at Stan Efferding. Just go to stanefferding.com. My online training's on there. My meal prep company, I've got the Vertical Diet Meal Prep, where we prepare these low FODMAP meals with no vegetable oils and ship them nationwide. And my ebook is on there. Everything's at stanefferding.com. And I've got a whole lot of my Rhinos rants. I poured a lot into those. I spent a lot of time researching and writing them and recording them so that people could hear a lot of this stuff that I talk about for free. And that's on at my YouTube channel at Stan Efferding, and then my Instagram's at Stan Efferding, so it's easy to find.
Awesome. It was a pleasure having you and an honor to sit down and talk to you.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you for your time.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, brother.
Yeah. We can do the fist bump.
I got cold.